So, welcome everyone. I'm going to talk about Riverpod, a reactive caching and data binding frameworks. That's what it says on the website. And I talked to Remy, the author of this package, and some of the things that I'm mentioning today is actually being supervised by him directly, as we are working both in the same company in Vertex. But let's move on and talk about Riverpod. This is going to be a complete guide on Riverpod today, including best practices and also some tips and tricks, and also some, testing tricks that probably is going to be interesting for you. S- I'm going to talk about, the agenda for today. It will be Riverpod and versus provider. That's a very like a common questions many times I receive, and people say, "Oh, what is it like? And why we have Riverpod where we already had providers?" So we're gonna get into that quickly. There are a bunch of providers in Riverpod, so we need to get into that and see when to use what, and and have different. For sure different use cases for each of them, and then best practices, some tricks here so where it will help you to write better code for sure, and at the end, testing. um so let me introduce myself. My name is Majid. I'm based in Oslo, a software engineer. Now I am head of DevRel at Invertase, a company that is doing a lot of open source. And you can find me, and also very active in Flutter community. Many of you perhaps have seen my tweets or articles or maybe videos on YouTube. So you can find me on internet with the handler that you see. I will share this slide and other useful information about myself at the end of this, the talk. So bear with me a bit. Let's talk about provider. So when we're talking about Riverpod, then the first question is then why there is actually another package provider. So there is another talk by Remy himself talking about, his decision of creating a new package instead of providing provider two a package. But technically, Riverpod means that so your provider package, if you're using that, it's actually one of the things that Google is pushing a lot. And the Flutter team, you see it many places. Um, but the author himself said that he prefers using Riverpod instead of provider, and he's not gonna add any feature to provider except bug fixes and language features. But Riverpod itself is quite actually stable right now. You can build any size of application with it, and it has a lot of features that provider doesn't have. It comes with a comprehensive solution for not only state management but also for um, patterns such as singletons, such as dependency injection, and things like that. And also, um, well, somehow the author of package mentioned the provider package. Remy mentioned that Riverpod is actually provided too, but he prefers to keep it in separate packages. And a lot of improvement on developer experience and tooling. But when we open the provider or Riverpod, sorry, package, the first thing that you will notice is that there are many providers. So the first thing that you may ask is like, what is this provider? Like, in fact, there is a simple answer to that, which is it's a piece of code, like an object that encapsulates your states, and and then it allows you to listen to that states. But there are reasons that you might want to use these providers, like a bunch of them. So like, for example, if you want to access these, states or these providers different places, like you can think of it as a dependency injection, for example. And one nice thing is that here you are not really dependent on build context in this case. And that's actually very nice for those who are a little bit like struggling with the build context. And it simplifies, combining several, providers. And that's one of the things that we're going to talk about today. So there are advanced use cases where you want to actually listen to a changing of a state and then, provide another, type of a state based on that, or do something else like make a network call, for example. We're going to talk about all of this in it today. So, and one interesting things about Riverpod, which probably if you have done any provider before, you may agree with me at the end of the talk, is that it makes your code way more testable. And it's very actually easy to write test in that case. So we'll get into testing at the last section of this presentation. But when you look at the documentation, you'll see 5 different or 6 different providers. Sorry. So the simplest one is provider, of course, state provider, state notifier providers, change notifier provider, stream, and future provider. We'll get into these very quickly. I made a table for you quickly that you can take a look and quickly have a comparison here, like what are the differences here and what you can do in this case. But before, I'm not gonna go through this table. It's just for your reference later. But we will actually get into these examples in today's session. First thing you need to do, like make sure you have the package. I actually added these slides to show you the reason is there will be actually a new version of provider Riverpod version 2. At the moment it's on dev, but in the next few months it will be a new major release. However, it might not have like so many breaking changes, so don't worry about it. So most of the things that you see today, you can use it most likely with version 2 as well. One important thing before you start doing anything is that you need to wrap your main widgetry main application with provider scope. And the provider scope is doing a bunch of things for you, and including creating an implicit provider container where all the states are encapsulated over there. So there is no leakage of state at all. So despite the fact that you will see shortly, the providers are defined kind of like as a global variable, but the states are not global at all. You cannot, simply access them. So then let's take a look at the simplest one. There are a few things that I will talk about it slowly because they are like a foundation to the more advanced and more complex use cases that I have in this talk. And so I think when we understand the basics and the foundation, if you have not used Riverpod so far, so it's giving you like a good time when I'm talking about more advanced use cases. Let's talk about them. So we're gonna have so the simplest provider where it just actually provides you a simple value, and in this case I have a string, and then in the provider I'm gonna have a callback which has a parameter named ref. We will see this ref a lot, and that's a very powerful parameters here, which gives you a lot of flexibility. Later we're going to talk about it, and then you can return your value, which in this case is just in a string. Make sure one tip for you here is that always have your providers defined with final keyword. Once you do that, well, the simplest or the first step that you can use that, simple, provider that you defined is to have a consumer widget where the consumer widget gives you a builder. And in that builder, you're going to have 3 parameters. The context, the build context, definitely something that you're familiar as a Flutter developer. The child, you're familiar. And the second one is ref. That's the widget ref, which is particularly for Riverpod. It's interesting because then in ref, you have a bunch of methods, and one of them is watch method, where you can watch your provider that you defined, and it gives you the value that you defined in your provider. In this case, it will be inverted. So in fact, if I now run this piece of code, I would see perhaps, just a simple application that is showing this text. But that's a very basic one. And that's very similar to what you've done probably before also with provider package. But let's have there is one problem with that. So you may now quickly think about it, oh, it's actually coming with a builder. So that means if I want to have several providers, then I'm gonna have a builder probably hell, like so many builder. So there's actually a better way of doing that. If you want to use, different providers inside the widget, is that you can actually extend. If you look at line 4, you can extend your widget extend the consumer widget, which is provided by Riverpod. And the difference is it's actually very similar to other widgets that you have in Flutter, except that the build will have second parameters, which is going to be widget ref from Riverpod. And that's where you can simplify your code a bit, and you can just watch again to your provider and do whatever you've done. If we just quickly take a look at the previous example, you look at that, we had this build context, consumer, and then build. And we can now simplify that with a consumer widget and a build, simple as you've done, a ref, listen to your provider. Here in this case, watch the changes, and then do whatever you want, like show the text. All right. But this one is very simple. It may not satisfy your use cases. There are a lot of use cases that you may want to go further. And one of those is going to be, handling, let's say if you have a filter in your application, like you have a product and you want to filter based on price, based on, text and so on. And so here is the case where you have state provider. A state provider is actually a bit more advanced from provider, but not as advanced as you think, but it's actually solving simple states, that you may want to access or change. Common use cases, as I mentioned here, is like changing a Boolean for a checkbox or a pagination, or having a filter type, or search, for example. You have a search box and the text in the search box is changing. So these are use cases that you may want to, like a simple state here in this case. Better not to use a state provider if you have some kind of validation logic or some business logic, let's say, or a complex data type like an object like list or class or map or stuff. So it's better to use other things that we're going to mention shortly. So let's move on. Here is an example that I actually wrote for you to give you an overview of what is a state provider. Let's imagine you have a product sort type, as I mentioned. That's a very common use case. You can think about different, similar things. So you're going to have this sorting as an enum, name and price. And so you see a class a product class in this case, where this is your model, and you're going to have a name and price for this product, and you have a list of product. In this case, I just hard-coded in line 14 to 18, just 3 products, but later in the slides, we will actually replace this with a network call. It's going to be very interesting. But for now, we have 3 products. Based on name and price, we're going to sort them out. So first thing we're going to do is I'm going to use a state provider and pass my, type, which is my enum, and just say I want the initial value to be product sort.name. So initial value is going to be name. Okay, fine. Now I defined a state node provider. What's the difference between that and the previous one? Take a look at that. Let's imagine we're going to have a drop down. It's going to be a drop down here and 2 values, right? So product sort name and product sort type price, right? These 2 values. We're going to change this drop down in the application and then do something with it. So the drop down button will have a value where in this case, you're going to just have the ref watch. So in the previous slides for provider, I said something fundamental. We're extending our widget from consumer widget, remember? So we're going to have the ref in the build from now on. I'm not going to repeat that anymore. So we're going to actually look at this ref watch and look at the value. So the dropdown will show the default value, which in this case is going to be the name, right? The product sort type.name. And then the unchanged, the value is those values that I defined in the dropdown items. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to actually read my provider and change the state here. So, and ignore that notifier, is actually not correct. So, change the state here to the value that I'm receiving on change. So I have one more method here for you here. It says read. We're gonna quickly talk about read and watch. What are the differences here? When to use what? But so again, this is going to be our value, and when I change, that is going to change. In fact, you're gonna read the state and change the state because you read that provider. So, but what is the difference between watch and read in this case? So you're gonna use you're not gonna use watch in callbacks, asynchronous callbacks, especially like buttons and stuff like that. Instead, in those scenarios, you will use read instead. Well, and also there are other scenarios that the watch should not be called, that I mentioned right now here. But the most common one is when you have an interaction on a button, like, for example, a callback on an on-press or in initial state. That's where you're going to use read instead. So, but let's take a look at that right now. So we defined our products in the 2 slides before, right? And there was a list of products, 3 products, if you remember. We build our UI with state notifier, changing that dropdown. Now I am actually defining another provider, just a simple provider, a list of products. And I build my, application. And here is the things. You remember I mentioned there is actually a powerful things about ref. In fact, inside a provider, you can check you can watch other providers. And in this case, I have a simple provider to return a list of products, right? But inside that provider, I can watch in line 10 provider sort type that I defined. And then based on the sort type I receive, its name or price, I can change the products and return, that product. This is the time that you can combine different products and listen to change of another product state and do something in another product, which is interesting. And now you can have the product here, in this case, product provider, and then in the list view, you just build your view simply. As simple as that. Don't do anything else. All right. So now we have this simple state notifier, simple state provider. We're going to talk about a more advanced use case. So most of the time, your state might have some kind of logic where, for example, you have a list of to-dos or tasks or products where you want to add, remove, toggle, stuff like that. These are the things that can all be held inside an state notifier. So an state notifier is actually a package that you can check. It's very similar to change notifier, except that everything is immutable. So it's actually very nice way of handling your state. Immutability is always a good thing in an application. And you can also have your business logic in this case. But let's take a look at that. Imagine now we have an object, a task object, and that's going to be immutable. And because it's immutable, I need to have a copy with where I can copy my, object or create a new one. So in this case, so I defined everything as you see in this class, fairly straightforward. So as probably you do everything your everyday work. So the next thing I'll have to do is I'm going to have a class of tasks notifier where it's going to extend state notifier. And a state notifier is going to have a list of tasks. And a state notifier state is immutable. That means the time that I actually, in line 12 to 18, that means if you want to toggle something or change in a state here, you need to do it in a way that you do the immutable object. So in this case, I do it that way, right? But that's nice. So far, this is not really very different from what we've done. But let's talk about state notifier provider in this case. So here's the things. I actually pass my state notifier or task notifier in this case that I extended, which is going to have my a state and also the type of a state, which is going to be a list of tasks, right? And my provider, state notifier provider, we're going to return my task notifier. So far, so good. As simple as others. So I just made that. But let's take a look at the difference between this and the last two ones. So again, I'm going to just extend my consumer widget. And in build, I'm going to have the ref, right? So in the ref, I can watch my state task notifier provider. I'm going to watch my notifier here in this case. And it gives me the list of tasks for sure. Okay. And then I'm going to have a list view where I can build a checkbox here in this case. So just going to iterate over the task and then going to have a checklist. You look at this UI, very simple, similar what you've done in Flutter. And the value for the checklist is going to be the task completed. And if you look at now that on change on line 15, I'm going to read my notifier from the provider. And then once I do that, I actually get access to the toggle function that I defined inside my state notifier. Now I can pass my task and toggle, the state. And that UI will be built. Look at this, how simple you write this. And now take a look at, we can take a look at the UI. So with just a few lines of code, we're going to achieve a very complex ones. Well, let's take a look at that right now. Now I'm actually toggling. I have only two tasks, number 1 and 2. I'm simply changing that, and my state is also immutable. Similar to state notifier, we're going to have change notifier. If you've done any Flutter so far, you perhaps are familiar with change notifiers. It's the same thing from Flutter itself, and you perhaps use it in provider. If you've used provider package before, it's going to be pretty familiar to you as well. But if not, the difference between this one and the state notifier is that the change notifier, it's actually, you're going to use it when you have a mutable state. There might be some use cases that you're going to use, and let's have the exact same example that we had. The task, I define the task. In this case, look at the task. It's not immutable. The variables are not immutable, they are mutable. So I define my list of tasks in my change notifier class, or task notifier in this case. And in line 16 to 20, I actually mutate my state, the task state, like change the complete to not complete or whatever, like toggle, and then notify the listeners. This is exactly what you do like normally in a change notifier in Flutter. So now I'm going to actually use Riverpod to handle that for me. Let's see how simpler it will be. We're going to have a change notifier provider. Well, definitely a class would be task notifiers, the change notifier, which we extended. And in this case, in the build method, we're going to have a watch over the providers that we created, the change notifier, and it gives us the tasks which we defined in the class, in our state class. And then lastly, the same would be nearly identical. So we're going to have like exactly the same thing, except that, our state right now is mutable. All right. Two more providers, and these are very similar in terms of usability. The only difference is that one of them is going to be used in like stream situation where you have a lot of streams and you need to return an observable, object stuff. And then you have the feature provider where you need to do like an asynchronous code, for example, or doing some kind of network request, or caching stuff asynchronously, or operation that is done synchronously. So whatever I say about the like future provider, it's almost identical to stream provider 2. You can use that. The only difference is between future and stream. The one thing about the stream provider, which I really like about, is like a lot of times if you need to define your stream, sometimes you need to just think about what is the difference between a broadcast stream or a normal streams, stuff like that. These are the things that Riverpod, a stream provider, will kind of remove from you. You don't need to think about it. Or another thing is very interesting, where you're going to have like in a stream and it caches the latest value, which means when you listen to that provider, so you get the latest, cached values, which is very nice. These are the stuff that you need to handle yourself, but it's handled by the framework, or in this case, Riverpod package. So let's talk about it right now. Let's imagine you're going to have some kind of configuration, and that configuration is changing, and it's like in a stream, you need to listen to that change, or it's going to be a feature, for example. Doesn't matter in this case. We're going to have this object which has this from JSON to JSON stuff in any way that you want to create it. I'm going to use freeze in this case. So let's now have this, combined with our feature provider. Let's say I am going to use this configuration. I mean, a good thing about using feature provider is that it's actually asynchronous. It does not block your UI, and it's a good thing. So you can actually use JSON decode, or maybe like all of those things that I wrote inside the function, like in the application, but it may block. But in this case, it will not, because you're using feature provider. And so here is an example where you can actually load your string from that. Let's say you have a JSON configuration and your assets, and then you can return that configuration. And later, that is going to return an async value, which is going to be your configuration object, right? And when you build your UI in any widget that, again, we extend that consumer widget, you're going to have a widget ref. You're going to listen to this provider, and that is giving you an async value of config. And why this is interesting, an async value, because it gives you a function on that name when. Again, this is a way that it will simplify your application a lot. So a lot of time when you have an async operation, you need to think about at least 3 states. When you have the data, when it's success, when there is a loading, and when there is an error. And the then method here, in this case, gonna give you all 3, which is going to handle, different use cases for you. In this case, you can return that and react to those states accordingly. For example, when the data is coming, so you can just show your host, which was one of the variable of the config. Interesting. That is going to simplify a lot your code. So we mentioned about these 3 ones, and that is a nice thing to have. Let's continue now. Technically, I didn't actually put any example for a stream, but that's very similar to what you do with feature. Almost the same thing, except that everything is about stream. You can think about like having a WebSocket, and you want to fetch data and stuff like that. And that's going to be stream. So you need to put it inside the stream provider instead of feature provider. Okay. From now on, things getting much more interesting because we're going to have more fun with these providers. We learned about these 6 types of providers. Now we're going to talk about different use cases and advanced use cases in this case. One of the things that you do in application, the building application, is many times you need to combine your states. You need to listen to an state. Once that's changed, do something and return another state for another provider. This is very common. And in fact, this is one of the things that you can do with Riverpod as easy as possible. Imagine now you have 2 providers. And a state provider returning you, as we already had in the examples, product sort type, and you have an HTTP client like Dio or whatever, HTTP. 2 providers, right? Simple. You define that. Now you define your products provider where it's going to get the product. Well, by default, now let's look at this. You have a ref here where it's allowing you to watch to other providers' state. In this case, I am watching product sort type provider where I could change via that dropdown. Now I also can watch to my Dio provider or HTTP client, whatever client I have. It's kind of like a dependency injection here. I watch that, and then I can sorry. And then I can make an HTTP call here, wait for the response. And in this case, let's say my endpoint, my URL is accepting some kind of parameters or query param, says sort, and I pass the sort, and I get the products based on that sort type. And once that's received, I just return my product, a list of products as I defined in the type. But now imagine the sort, the product sort type is changing in the UI. That's coming to this again, and that's going to fetch the products based on price, and boom, you're going to have the products. As simple as this. You don't need to do anything else. Let's have another example here. So you're going to have a state notifier again. We have the same thing. We talked about the product sort type. Then we're going to have the HTTP client. If you don't want to actually use or watch all the time inside your provider here, you may want to create, like, if you don't want to listen like all the time here, you may actually want to go and provide or define a provider with another class. Like if you're following repository pattern, for example, like having repositories in infrastructure like data and repository and UI layer, you may have your repository in this case here. And a very common use case, the best practice is to pass your read object here to this repository. Now let's take a look at this repository, what it happens. Technically, you're defining the same thing, except that you need to explicitly also call, you need to provide repository provider and explicitly call fetch products whenever you want, right? And in this case, I can use read method. So another good example is if you are using the context of, or the scope of the callback in the provider, don't use read. I think I mentioned that in the beginning too. But if you are doing this way, like you're adding a repository class and you have another function, you can now use read instead. So now I have like read here in this case. I can actually listen to, or actually read, get the state of that type and fetch the data as you can go. Like it's another, interesting things that you can definitely do. In this case, that doesn't continuously change, except that you can get this provider and fetch products whenever it's necessary. Okay. Good practices here. First of all, do not call read inside the body of a provider. Like this is a very bad practice to have a read under the provider, because it may provide like building too many of your providers or states where it's not necessary. Another good practice is do not listen to all changes. Like for example, we have a user, and when user state, like for example, the auth state is changing, we're going to do something, or the name is changing, we're going to do something. Why would you listen to all changes? That's not really necessary in this case. So in that case, you can use something that is very interesting, and I will show you in this slide. Use select instead. Select is a very nice operator here, where it's a method that you can select one piece of your state from that class that you pass. Like in this case, in the configuration, I do not listen to all changes in configuration. If the host is changing, I want to refetch my products. And that is where you can do that in your, providers. It's very, very powerful tools again here. And one tip for you, in version 2 of Provider, you will have select async, which is almost identical with just a different name. And let's have another example, like of select. Let's imagine you're going to have a user which is going to have a name and age. And in one of your widgets, you're just going to listen and change or build the UI when the name is changing or the age is changing, for example. You don't want to rebuild the entire UI because something else has changed that you never used it in the UI. And that's where you can, again, use select in this case and have only a piece of a state that you want to listen to change and rebuild your UI. Modifiers. It's two interesting things that I'm going to mention right now, pretty advanced one too. Many times you may not need to have a state when something goes wrong or when you leave a page, let's say, right? And you want to come back to a page and reload everything. Or when it's failing, you don't want to do, you just want to dispose everything, no state. And future provider and stream provider comes with a modifier named auto dispose, where it's automatically destroyed the state of a provider when it's no longer needed. So, and here is an example for you. So I made it. You're going to have like one of these HTTP methods, for example. One thing that I have to mention here is that when you use Dispose, the ref will have one more property in version 1, which is going to be maintain state. I will give you the use case in this case, why you would use a maintain state in this case. And in version 2, it will be keep alive function. It's technically the same thing, different naming in 2 different versions. But what maintain state does is it says, like, let's have a scenario. You're going to go to a page and that fails, where you come back to another page and say, okay, it's failing. That's fine. No state, dispose, done. Okay. You come back again to a page and it will refetch again. And at this time, if you use maintain state true, you refetch, and at this time it fetches everything. It actually stores and caches this fetch. If you go back to another page and come back to this page, because it has some value, then it keeps the state and it does not refetch that again. That's a nice thing about these maintain states. Another modifier is family. A lot of time in your application, you want to pass actually like another parameters to your provider to do something. Like, I give you again a scenario. You have a list of products, you click on the products, you go to a detailed products, and now you want to fetch the product details, but you have the ID. So in this case, you can pass the ID to provider. Here is using family. You say, and if you do that, then in your callback in the provider, feature provider, you'll get that value, string, and ID. And in this case, you can actually fetch your URL and, do whatever you want. And in your build, the only difference is that, look at line 17, you need to now, instead of just having provider or product provider in this case, you need to also pass the ID. Like, it will become like a function in this case. Nice. So simple. And let's have another use case, a little bit advanced. You may want to actually combine both. There is actually a time that you want to dispose your state, especially when you are passing, you have multiple, changes. Let's take a look at that. Like, for example, you want to have the same ID for products, and you can combine it with when as well. So that means auto dispose can be combined with when. About auto dispose, though, so when the parameters you're passing, in this case, the ID wasn't a string. You can add like a string, integer, and stuff like that. And if that value is constant, like the ID in this case is not gonna change. It's a constant thing, right? In this case, well, use if it's not constant, also use dispose. Like, for example, you have a search box and you want to just search something, and the text of the search box is actually changing constantly. So it goes to your provider. If you define the provider in this case with family, use auto dispose, which is helping you to prevent the memory leak and listening too much and stuff like that. So it's actually a preferred way of doing that. And when you have that parameters, the ID I mentioned, it must be, it should have a consistent hash code and equal. So, like, what does it mean? It means like you cannot simply pass an object. You need to have an object that is using some kind of tuple or freezed or like equatable, these kind of object that has that, hash code, a consistent hash code. That is very important to have in mind when you have these parameters. An example would be, let's say you're going to pass a parameters as a class built with freeze. In this case, you can pass it. That's fine. And it will work. If you do not do that, it doesn't work. And provider observer. So another very interesting object that is under your hand, and a use case. You probably have seen observers in Flutter applications if you have worked with any Flutter application before. Almost similar concept. So you're going to have three functions here in this case: did add provider, did dispose provider, and did update provider, similar to other concept in Flutter. So a use case here is that, like, you want to listen to these changes in the providers and do something with it. Like, for example, you want to make a log, or you want to maybe listen to all the errors and report to your, error reporting system or stuff like that when the state is throwing some kind of error. This is something that you can do with by extending provider observer. Here's an example of a logger where in the beginning of the talk, we had provider scope, where you can just pass a child, but observers are optional, so you can pass a list of observers. In this case, I pass my logger. And when you do that, then in your console, you will see all these logs coming along. Ref.listen. So we had ref.watch and ref.read so far, and we understood the difference. So a listen, it's a very interesting one in this case. Very similar to watch, but it has a use case for itself. When you have listen, first of all, you need to pass two positional parameters. One is your provider, and another one is going to be a callback with a previous, state and a new state. Imagine you're going to have these user provider, which we defined in previous slides. You're going to select a name. Say whenever a name is changing, I want to listen to that. Very similar to watch, except now I don't want to build anything. I just want to call something. It's a very common use case for showing a snack bar or a pop-up or something like that. Or name is changing. I show a snack bar and says, oh, your name has changed. And these are the stuff that you may want to do with listen. So very, a little bit different from watch, although the functionality is almost the same. Testing. I want to show you why I love Riverpod in this case, because testing is super duper easy. Let me tell you a few things in this case. When we are talking about testing, there are a couple of things that you probably need to think about it. Like states should not be preserved between test and test widgets, and like in this case, the global variables, you need to reset them in tear down and and set up in the setup function. You need to have some kind of override or forcing providers to use a mock data or something like that. You need to somehow, you may think that providers, so far I showed you, they are actually defined globally. That's fine, but the state are not global at all. They in fact goes to something named provider container, and the provider container is implicitly created by provider scope in Flutter widgets. So then in this case, the test widgets that you're going to write doesn't need any tear down and set up. Let's take a look at that. Let's imagine we're going to have a state provider. We talked about it so far. And we're going to just have an elevated button on press, read, and then click and change the state. So far, so good. Okay. So how I'm going to test this? What I'm going to do here in this case, I'm going to test the widgets. Let's take a look at that. So first of all, I'm going to just bump or create my widget tree by providing provider scope, my app, fine. Then I'm expecting to see 0 for sure, and I will see that, and 1 when nothing. And then I will try to click on the elevated button, and so then the state will change because of my logic, and it will go to 1, 0. You would imagine that if it's a global state, then if I run the second test, then the state should stay 0 and 1, or sorry, 1 and 0, because it changed in the previous one. You have to have some kind of tear down and or maybe set up to just reset that. However, that's not the case. Now I run the second test immediately, do the same thing, and I will see the exact initial value of that state. So super simple to test in this case. Let's have a little bit more advanced. So you have a lot of time, a fetch or like a network request or something that you want to mock. And this is the case that in Provider, you have an override with value, where you can actually override your, functions or, your data or stuff like that. So in this case, for example, I can override my, to-do list or whatever task list with a value, an async data value that I have. That's very valuable for my testing. So if I go now to like having another example, imagine that I had like a repository and I had to fetch products and stuff. Well, that's nice. So in this case, so I can actually create my provider from this repository, and then I can create a fake repository for testing only, which is going to return only one product in this case. That's going to be ID 42, label, hello world, price 200. And I will have, I'm going to use this repository in my product UI. Now I'm going to test this product UI. What I'm going to do here, I'm going to actually look at line 3 or line 5. It's a case here that I mentioned. I actually can override my provider with a fake repository that I created, right? So as simple as that. And then once I call or bump my widget, then I should expect the UI to show my returned value, in this case, which I'm testing. Super simple to do all of these testings. All right, so I talked a lot. It's about 50 minutes. So now let's summarize. So in this 50 minutes presentation, I went through like the differences between Riverpod and Provider and showed you why you need to use Riverpod instead of Provider. We talked about all the providers, 6 providers in Riverpod and the use cases. We talked about best practices, where to use what and what kind of things that you need to avoid in order to have a better code and as well as a better performance. And also, we talked about all the advanced use cases, combining these, Riverpod, the providers, and having auto dispose and stuff like that. And for testing, definitely we went through 2 at least important use cases, like checking the simple providers states, and we've seen that there is no need for teardown or setup. Also, we checked the mocking, pathing the fake repositories with whatever we wanted, and tested our provider UIs. And with that said, thank you very much. You can definitely reach out to me on social media. My handler is MHA Daily. So on Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube, wherever you want to find me. And also, you can find all the slides and sample codes on slides.com/myhandler. That's going to be the first one. So there are a bunch of other slides that you may want to look at that. They're going to be interesting to you. But the first one right now is going to be the Riverpod slides that I presented to you right now. Thank you very much for your attention. If you have any question, comments, please let me know. I'll do my best to answer all of that.